The late afternoon sun hung low in the Tennessee sky as Staff Sergeant James Morgan guided the military-issued black SUV off the highway. The vehicle's tank was running low after a long day of training exercises, and the small gas station ahead seemed like their best option. The dashboard clock showed 6:45 p.m., and the orange glow of sunset painted long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot. Morgan wasn't alone in the vehicle. 3 other Army Rangers sat with him, all of them wearing their casual military uniforms after finishing their training at Fort Campbell. In the passenger seat, Specialist Mike Chen stared at his phone, checking messages from his wife. Behind him, Private First Class Carlos Rodriguez fought to stay awake, the day's intense training exercises having drained his energy. Corporal David Williams, seated behind Morgan, was already planning to grab a much-needed coffee from the station's small convenience store. The gas station wasn't much to look at, just a simple building with 4 pumps under a worn metal awning. The sign out front read Pete's Gas and Grocery, with prices that were slightly better than those closer to the base. A rusty pickup truck was the only other vehicle in sight, its owner presumably inside the store. The place had that quiet, lonely feeling common to rural stations just off the highway. As Morgan pulled up to the pump, the SUV's tires crunched over small pieces of gravel. The sound seemed unusually loud in the evening quiet. Through the windshield, they could see an older man behind the counter inside, his attention fixed on a small TV mounted in the corner. A bell chimed as a tired-looking trucker walked out, carrying a cup of coffee and a bag of chips. "All right, let's make this quick," Morgan said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to giving orders. "Rodriguez, you're on gas duty. Williams, go ahead and get your coffee before you fall asleep on us. Chen, maybe grab us some water bottles for the road back." The 4 soldiers moved with the coordinated efficiency that came from years of working together. They weren't actively thinking about security or threats. This was just a simple gas stop, after all, but their training showed in the way they automatically positioned themselves. Morgan stayed near the vehicle, maintaining a clear view of their surroundings. Rodriguez stood by the pump, his posture relaxed but alert. Chen and Williams headed toward the store, unconsciously scanning the area as they walked. Inside the store, the air conditioning hummed loudly, fighting against the lingering heat of the day. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over shelves stocked with typical gas station fare, snacks, basic groceries, and travel necessities. The clerk, whose name tag read Earl, gave Chen and Williams a respectful nod, recognizing their military bearing even in casual clothes. Williams made his way to the coffee station, where a pot of dark roast had been sitting on the warmer for what was probably too long. Chen grabbed 4 bottles of water from the cooler, the cold condensation immediately forming on the plastic. The store's radio played old country music quietly in the background, some song about lost love and long roads. Outside, Rodriguez watched the numbers climb on the pump's digital display. The SUV's tank was bigger than a regular vehicle's, and filling it completely would take a few minutes. Morgan leaned against the driver's side door, his eyes automatically tracking movement. The occasional car passing on the highway, a plastic bag blowing across the lot, a cat slinking along the building's edge. None of them were expecting any trouble. This was just another routine stop on their way back to base, the kind they'd made hundreds of times before. The evening was peaceful, the air still warm, but cooling as the sun continued its descent. In the distance, crickets had started their evening chorus, and somewhere nearby, a lonely dog barked at something unseen. The soldiers' attention was focused on the simple tasks at hand: fueling the vehicle, getting drinks, stretching tired muscles after a long day. Their guard wasn't exactly down, because soldiers' guards are never completely down, but they were relaxed. They were in friendly territory, just a few hours from their base, in a quiet part of Tennessee where the biggest excitement usually came from high school football games and county fairs. What none of them knew, as they went about these mundane tasks, was that the peaceful evening was about to be shattered. The trouble that was heading their way would soon turn this simple gas stop into something that would be talked about in local bars and barber shops for years to come. But for now, in these last few moments of calm, there were just 4 tired soldiers, looking forward to getting back to base and calling it a day. The peaceful evening at Pete's Gas and Grocery was suddenly interrupted by the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. At first, it was just a low growl, barely noticeable over the sound of the gas pump. But the noise grew louder, like approaching thunder, until 6 Harley-Davidson motorcycles roared into the station's lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the fading sunlight. The bikers weren't the friendly weekend riders who sometimes pass through. These men belonged to a local gang called the Steel Wolves, known for causing trouble in nearby towns. Their leather vests displayed their gang patches proudly, decorated with symbols that told stories of their notorious reputation. Their bikes formed a semicircle near the second gas pump, engines revving unnecessarily loud before being cut off. The leader of the group, a tall man who went by the name Snake, stepped off his bike first. His arms were covered in tattoos that disappeared into his leather vest, and a long gray beard hung down to his chest. A bandana with skull patterns wrapped around his head, and heavy boots crunched against the gravel as he surveyed the scene. His cold eyes immediately locked onto the military SUV and the soldiers around it. Inside the store, Chen and Williams noticed the change in atmosphere. The clerk, Earl, tensed up visibly, his hand moving closer to the phone on the counter. Other bikers began dismounting their motorcycles. There was Razor, Snake's right-hand man, built like a bull with arms as thick as most men's legs. Then came Tiny, who was anything but tiny, Hawk, Diesel, and Chains, each one looking more menacing than the last. Outside, Staff Sergeant Morgan hadn't moved from his position, but his posture had shifted slightly. His eyes tracked the biker's movements with the practiced attention of someone who had seen real combat. Rodriguez continued filling the tank, but his free hand had unconsciously balled into a fist at his side. Well? Snake's voice carried across the lot as he nudged one of his companions. Look what we got here, boys, some of Uncle Sam's finest. His tone dripped with sarcasm, and a few of his gang members chuckled darkly. The bikers began to spread out, moving with deliberate slowness. Razor walked toward the store's entrance, purposefully blocking the path that Chen and Williams would need to take to return to their vehicle. Tiny and Hawk positioned themselves near the other gas pump, pretending to be interested in the prices while keeping their eyes on Rodriguez. Inside the store, Chen and Williams exchanged a quick glance. Without saying a word, they both understood the situation was deteriorating. They'd been in enough tense situations to recognize the signs. Williams put down his coffee cup, unopened, while Chen kept the water bottles in his hands, watching the bikers through the store's windows. Snake took another step forward, his boots scraping against the pavement. You boys look a little lost, he called out, his voice carrying a challenge. This ain't no military base. This here's local territory. Behind him, his gang members smirked, some of them cracking their knuckles or adjusting their leather gloves. Morgan remained calm, his face showing no reaction to the obvious provocations. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady and professional. We're just getting gas, gentlemen. No need for any trouble. His words were polite, but there was an underlying firmness that his fellow soldiers recognized, the same tone he used just before things got serious during training exercises. The tension in the air grew thicker as the sun continued to set, casting long shadows across the gas station lot. Earl, the clerk, had already picked up his phone but hadn't dialed yet, watching the scene unfold through the store's windows. The only other customer, an elderly man who had been browsing the snack aisle, quietly made his way to the back of the store. Snake took another step forward, now close enough that Morgan could smell the leather of his vest and the cigarette smoke clinging to his beard. Maybe you boys didn't hear me right, Snake growled, his voice dropping lower. This is our turf, and we ain't too fond of your type around here. The other bikers had moved closer too, forming a loose circle around the soldier's vehicle. Rodriguez had finished filling the tank, but hadn't removed the nozzle yet, his eyes steady as he watched Tiny and Hawk draw nearer. Inside the store, Chen and Williams stood ready, their military training keeping them alert and focused despite the growing hostility outside. The evening air crackled with tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. Everyone present could feel that something was about to happen, something that would turn this quiet gas station into the scene of an unforgettable confrontation. The confrontation at Pete's Gas and Grocery took its first ugly turn when Razor deliberately bumped into Rodriguez as he was finally removing the gas nozzle. The impact wasn't hard, but it was clearly intentional. Rodriguez kept his balance, his military training evident in how he maintained his composure despite the obvious provocation. Oh, sorry about that, Razor sneered, his voice dripping with fake concern. Didn't see you there. Behind him, several of the other bikers snickered. Snake watched the scene with a cruel smile playing across his weathered face, like a man enjoying the start of his favorite show. Inside the store, Chen and Williams remained stuck, with two bikers still blocking their path to the exit. Earl, the clerk, had now quietly dialed 911 on his phone, but kept it hidden below the counter. He spoke in whispers, describing the situation to the dispatcher while pretending to organize items under the register. "You military boys think you're something special, don't you?" Snake took a step closer to Staff Sergeant Morgan, who hadn't moved from his position near the driver's door. "Walking around in your fancy uniforms, acting all superior. But out here, you ain't on your base anymore." Morgan's voice remained steady as he replied, "We're not looking for any trouble. We've paid for our gas, and we'll be on our way." His calm response seemed to irritate Snake even more, like throwing water on a grease fire. Tiny, living up to his ironic nickname, moved to stand beside Rodriguez, towering over him. "Maybe they need a lesson in respect, Snake," he growled, cracking his massive knuckles. The sound echoed across the now silent gas station lot. The evening had grown darker, with the station's fluorescent lights now casting harsh shadows across the scene. A few cars drove past on the highway, their drivers completely unaware of the tension building at the small gas station. The crickets had gone quiet, as if they too could sense the approaching storm. "You know what really gets me?" Snake continued, taking another step toward Morgan. "How you military types walk around like you own the place, like you're better than everyone else." He spat on the ground near Morgan's boots. "But I bet without your fancy weapons and your backup, you ain't nothing special." Inside the store, Chen watched as Chains and Hawk began knocking items off shelves, creating a mess and further intimidating Earl. The elderly customer had retreated to the store's back room, where Earl had earlier gestured for him to hide. Williams caught Chen's eye and gave a subtle nod. They both knew this situation was about to explode. Rodriguez maintained his professional demeanor, even as Tiny and Razor continued to crowd him. "Sir," he addressed Snake, his voice firm but respectful, "we're not interested in proving anything. We just want to leave peacefully." This seemed to enrage Snake even more. "Did you hear that, boys?" he called out to his gang. "Sir," he says, "like we're at some fancy dinner party." The other bikers laughed on cue, the sound ugly and threatening in the tense atmosphere. Razor chose that moment to make his move. He reached out and shoved Rodriguez hard, sending him stumbling back against the SUV. "Oops," Razor laughed. "Guess I'm just clumsy today." Morgan's posture shifted slightly, a change so subtle that only his fellow soldiers noticed it. It was the same shift they'd seen during combat training, when he moved from defensive stance to ready position. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a different weight to it. "That was your first and last warning," Morgan stated, his words clear and measured. "Touch one of my men again, and you'll regret it." Snake's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Oh yeah? And what are you four gonna do about it? There's 6 of us, and we ain't exactly Boy Scouts." The bikers had now completely surrounded the soldiers. Tiny and Razor flanked Rodriguez, while Diesel and Chains moved to cut off any escape route Morgan might take. Inside the store, Hawk had moved closer to the door, effectively trapping Chen and Williams. The air grew thick with tension as Snake took one final step toward Morgan, bringing them face to face. "Last chance, soldier boy," Snake growled, his breath hot with the smell of cigarettes and cheap beer. "Either you and your boys get on your knees and apologize for disrespecting us, or things are gonna get real ugly real fast." Morgan's response was calm but carried an edge that made even Snake pause for a split second. "I don't think you want to do this," he said quietly. "But if you insist, remember, you chose what happens next." Snake made his fatal mistake when he threw the first punch. His fist swung toward Morgan's face in a wide, telegraphed arc, the kind of punch thrown by someone who learned to fight in bars rather than military training grounds. Morgan didn't even blink as he smoothly shifted his head just 2 inches to the side, letting the punch sail past his ear. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for everyone watching. The peaceful evening at Pete's Gas and Grocery erupted into controlled chaos as all 4 soldiers moved at once, their movements precise and coordinated like a well-rehearsed dance. As Snake's punch missed, Morgan grabbed the biker's extended arm and used his own momentum against him. In one fluid motion, he stepped inside Snake's guard, twisted his arm behind his back, and drove him face first into the side of the SUV. The sound of Snake's nose meeting metal echoed across the lot. Tiny and Razor rushed at Rodriguez, thinking their size advantage would make it an easy fight. They couldn't have been more wrong. Rodriguez, who had won his unit's hand-to-hand combat tournament 3 years running, dropped into a defensive stance. As Tiny reached for him, Rodriguez stepped forward instead of back, surprising both attackers. His elbow struck Tiny's solar plexus with mechanical precision, driving the air from the huge man's lungs. Before Tiny could recover, Rodriguez had already spun away, his boot connecting with Razor's knee with a sickening crack. Inside the store, Chen and Williams exploded into action. Chen moved first, driving his shoulder into Hawk's midsection like he was back on his high school wrestling team. The biker slammed into a display of chips, sending bags flying everywhere. Williams stepped past them, meeting Chains at the door. The biker swung the heavy chain as a weapon, but Williams had disarmed bigger men carrying actual weapons during his training. He caught the chain around his forearm, yanked Chains forward, and delivered a perfect strike to the biker's jaw. Diesel, seeing his friends falling one by one, pulled out a switchblade. The blade clicked open just as Morgan finished securing Snake. "Drop it," Morgan commanded, his voice carrying the authority of countless battlefield simulations. When Diesel hesitated, Morgan's foot shot out, catching the biker's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, followed quickly by Diesel himself as Morgan swept his legs out from under him. Earl watched in amazement from behind the counter, his phone still connected to 911. "You're not going to believe what I'm seeing," he told the dispatcher. "These bikers just picked a fight with the wrong people. The wrong people entirely." The entire confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. By the time the first police siren could be heard in the distance, all 6 bikers were on the ground. None of them were seriously injured. The soldiers had used exactly enough force to subdue them, no more and no less. Snake lay face down, his arms still locked behind his back by Morgan. Tiny sat against the gas pump, trying to remember how to breathe. Razor clutched his knee, moaning about ligaments. Hawk was buried in a pile of chip bags, looking dazed. Chains spat out a tooth onto the pavement, while Diesel lay spread-eagled on his back, staring at the evening sky and reconsidering his life choices. The elderly customer emerged from the back room, cell phone in hand. He had recorded the entire incident through the store window. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen," he declared, his hands shaking with excitement. "Just like in the movies, except better." Morgan maintained his hold on Snake, whose fight had completely drained away. "We tried to warn you," Morgan said calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. "Next time someone tells you they don't want trouble, maybe you should listen." Chen and Williams did a quick check of the store, making sure no other threats were present. Rodriguez kept watch over the other bikers, his stance relaxed but ready. None of the soldiers had broken a sweat, their breathing barely elevated from the brief exertion. The first police car pulled into the lot, lights flashing. The officer stepped out, took one look at the scene, and radioed for backup. "Dispatch," he said into his radio, "you better send an ambulance too. Not for the soldiers," he added quickly, noting the 4 calm military men standing among the groaning bikers. "Definitely for the others." Earl walked out from behind his counter, shaking his head in amazement. "I've seen a lot of things at this gas station," he said to no one in particular, "but I ain't never seen anything like that. Them boys just learned the hard way. You don't mess with Army Rangers." Red and blue lights filled the gas station parking lot as more police cars arrived at Pete's Gas and Grocery. Within 15 minutes of the fight, 3 patrol cars and an ambulance had responded to the scene. Officers moved quickly to secure the area, though they quickly realized the soldiers had everything well under control. Sheriff Tom Davidson, a veteran himself, stepped out of his cruiser and surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. The 6 bikers were still on the ground, most of them nursing various injuries but none seriously hurt. The 4 soldiers stood calmly to one side, their posture relaxed but alert as they gave their statements to a young deputy. "So," Sheriff Davidson said, approaching Morgan with a knowing smile, "I hear these gentlemen decided to test their luck against the wrong people." He pulled out his notepad, though his expression suggested he already knew exactly what had happened. Snake, now sitting on the curb with an ice pack held to his bloody nose, tried to tell a different story. "They attacked us," he protested, his voice nasal and muffled. We were just getting gas, and they jumped us. Earl, the gas station clerk, couldn't contain himself any longer. That's a load of bull, he called out from the doorway. I got the whole thing on security cameras. These bikers were looking for trouble the moment they pulled in. He turned to the elderly customer beside him, who was still excitedly showing his cell phone video to anyone who would look. The paramedics moved among the bikers, checking their injuries. Razor's knee would need further examination at the hospital. Tiny still struggled to breathe normally after the hit to his solar plexus. Chains kept running his tongue over the gap where his tooth used to be. Hawk had small cuts from the chips displayed he crashed into, while Daisel just looked shell-shocked. Let me show you something interesting, Earl said to the sheriff, leading him inside to the security monitor. The footage played out clearly on the screen, showing how the bikers had surrounded and threatened the soldiers, and how Snake had thrown the first punch. The sheriff nodded as he watched, occasionally writing notes. Outside, Chen and Williams helped the store clerk clean up the mess from the fight. Rodriguez assisted the paramedics in moving Razor to the ambulance, showing the same professionalism that had characterized their entire response to the situation. Morgan continued giving his statement, his voice calm and factual as he described the events. You boys showed remarkable restraint, Sheriff Davidson said after reviewing the footage. Could have done a lot more damage if you wanted to. He looked particularly at the knife Daisel had dropped, now sealed in an evidence bag. That could have made this a whole different kind of situation. The elderly customer, who introduced himself as Bill Thompson, couldn't stop replaying his video. My grandkids ain't gonna believe this, he said excitedly. Been coming to this gas station for 20 years, never seen anything like it, like something out of an action movie. As the situation calmed down, more details about the Steel Wolves gang came to light. Deputies discovered outstanding warrants for several members, including Snake, for various incidents in neighboring counties. What had started as a simple assault case was quickly expanding into something larger. Morgan gathered his team near their SUV, checking that everyone was okay. None of them had sustained any injuries, not even a scratch. They spoke quietly among themselves, discussing the incident with the professional detachment of soldiers reviewing a training exercise. You know, Sheriff Davidson said, approaching them one last time, the Steel Wolves have been causing trouble in this county for months now. Intimidating people, starting fights, vandalizing property. Nobody's been able to stand up to them. He smiled, looking at the now subdued bikers being processed by his deputies. Guess they finally picked on the wrong people. Earl emerged from the store carrying 4 fresh cups of coffee and a bag of snacks. On the house, he insisted, handing them to the soldiers. Least I can do. You boys probably just saved me from months of trouble with those guys. The sky had grown fully dark now, the gas station's fluorescent lights casting a bright glow over the scene. More locals had gathered at the edges of the property, word of the incident spreading quickly through the small community. They watched with satisfaction as the bikers were loaded into patrol cars, their motorcycles being impounded by the deputies. You boys need anything else? Sheriff Davidson asked Morgan, extending his hand. We got all we need for the report, and I'm sure you're ready to get back to base. News of the gas station incident spread through the small Tennessee town like wildfire. By the next morning, Bill Thompson's cell phone video had made its way onto local social media, and Pete's Gas and Grocery had become an unexpected tourist attraction. People drove by slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of where the now famous confrontation had taken place. Earl opened his store early that morning to find 3 local news vans parked in his lot. Reporters clutched coffee cups in the cool morning air, waiting eagerly to interview anyone connected to the previous night's events. The story was too good to ignore. 4 Army Rangers taking down 6 notorious bikers without breaking a sweat. It was something else, Earl told the first reporter, who thrust a microphone in his face. He stood proudly behind his counter, the security footage playing on a loop on his phone. Those soldiers were polite as could be, tried to avoid trouble. But when those bikers pushed it too far, he shook his head in admiration. It was like watching a martial arts movie, except this was real. At the local police station, Sheriff Davidson sat at his desk reviewing the arrest reports. Snake and his gang members sat in holding cells, their tough guy attitudes completely deflated. The discovery of outstanding warrants meant they wouldn't be causing trouble around town anytime soon. You really messed up this time, Snake, the sheriff said, looking through the cell bars. Multiple assault charges, concealed weapons, outstanding warrants. Looks like you and your boys are going away for a while. Snake just stared at the floor, his nose swollen and bruised, saying nothing. Back at Fort Campbell, word of the incident had already reached the base. As Morgan and his team arrived for morning training, they found themselves the center of attention. Other soldiers gathered around, wanting to hear first-hand accounts of what happened. Is it true you took down 6 bikers in less than a minute? A young private asked eagerly during their break. Morgan just shrugged, modest as ever. We didn't want any trouble. They made their choice, and we responded accordingly. His team nodded in agreement, none of them interested in bragging about what had happened. Their commanding officer, Colonel Richards, called them into his office later that morning. The 4 soldiers stood at attention, wondering if they were in for a reprimand. Instead, the colonel broke into a broad smile. "At ease, gentlemen," he said, gesturing to the local newspaper on his desk. The front page showed a still from the security footage, capturing the moment when the soldiers had taken control of the situation. "I've reviewed the incident reports. Your response was measured, professional, and exactly what we expect from Rangers." Back in town, the local diner was buzzing with excitement. The regular morning crowd couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Bill Thompson sat at his usual spot at the counter, showing his video for the 100th time to anyone who would watch. "Look at that move right there," he said enthusiastically, pointing at his phone screen. "That big fella, tiny, thought he had the advantage. But that soldier, Rodriguez, I think his name was, he moved like lightning. Never seen anything like it in my life." At Pete's Gas and Grocery, Earl had already put up a framed newspaper article on the wall behind his counter. He'd also added a new sign that read, "Home of the famous biker takedown, military personnel always welcome." The local coffee shop next door started offering a new drink called the Ranger Special. The story even reached the Steel Wolves' usual hangout spots. Other bikers who heard about the incident shook their heads in disbelief. Snake and his gang had always acted tough, pushing people around, but they'd finally pushed the wrong people. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone. Appearances could be deceiving, and those quiet, professional soldiers were not to be underestimated. By afternoon, Earl had given so many interviews his voice was getting hoarse. "You know what impressed me most?" he told yet another reporter. "Those soldiers could have really hurt those bikers if they wanted to, but they used just enough force to stop the threat. That's real training, real discipline right there." The incident became a turning point for the small town. What could have been a tragic story of violence instead became a tale of professional restraint and skilled response to danger. Local parents started telling their children, "Remember what happened at Pete's. That's why you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and why you should always respect our service members." 1 week after the incident at Pete's Gas and Grocery, the story had grown even bigger than anyone expected. The video of the confrontation, first shared by Bill Thompson, had gone viral on social media. National news websites picked up the story, running headlines like "Rangers Teach Troublemaking Bikers Unforgettable Lesson" and "Small-Town Gas Station Showdown, Military Training Meets Street Bullies." Snake and his gang members faced their first court appearance on a bright Monday morning. The courthouse was packed with curious locals who wanted to see the once-feared bikers face justice. The Steel Wolves didn't look so tough now, dressed in orange jumpsuits instead of their leather vests. "In all my years as a judge," Judge Sarah Martinez declared from the bench, "I've rarely seen such clear evidence of unprovoked aggression." She looked down at Snake, who kept his eyes fixed on the floor. His nose was still visibly crooked from his meeting with the SUV. The security footage and witness statements tell the whole story. "You gentlemen are lucky those soldiers showed such remarkable restraint." Earl's gas station had never been busier. People drove from neighboring counties just to see the famous location. He'd set up a small display near the register with newspaper clippings and photos. The chip display that Hawk had crashed into became a popular selfie spot, with Earl putting up a sign that read "Steel Wolf Landing Zone." "Business has doubled," Earl told his wife over dinner. "And you know what's really amazing? Not a single troublemaker has shown up since that night. Word got around fast, mess with my customers, and you might find yourself dealing with someone who really knows how to handle themselves." At Fort Campbell, Morgan and his team tried their best to avoid the attention, but their fellow soldiers had given them a new nickname, the Gas Station Warriors. During training exercises, Younger recruits would ask them to demonstrate the moves they'd used against the bikers. The thing is, Rodriguez explained to a group of new privates during hand-to-hand combat training, we couldn't do anything special, we just applied our training. It's not about being the toughest or strongest, it's about staying calm and using what you've learned. The local police department noticed an interesting change in the weeks following the incident. Reports of motorcycle gang activity in the area dropped to zero. Other troublemaking groups that have been causing problems suddenly became scarce. Sheriff Davidson couldn't help but smile every time he drove past Pete's Gas and Grocery. Sometimes, he told his deputies during a morning briefing, all it takes is one incident to remind the bad guys that they're not as tough as they think they are. Those rangers did more to clean up this county in 30 seconds than we could do in months of patrols. Bill Thompson had become something of a local celebrity. His grandson helped him set up a social media account where he shared his video and told the story to followers from around the world. My grandpa, the viral sensation, his grandson joked. Who would have thought? The elderly customer's video had racked up millions of views online. Combat veterans and martial arts experts posted detailed analyses of the soldiers' techniques, praising their efficiency and control. One popular comment read, "Notice how they neutralized the threat without causing serious injury. That's what real training looks like." Even national military publications picked up the story. Gas station incident demonstrates real-world application of military training, read one headline. The article praised the soldiers' disciplined response and professional restraint in a civilian situation. Earl had framed the judge's verdict when Snake and his gang were sentenced. The Steel Wolves wouldn't be terrorizing anyone for quite a while. Most of them faced several months in county jail, with Snake looking at over a year due to his previous warrants. You know what the best part is? Earl told customers who asked about that night. Those 4 soldiers never wanted any recognition. They just did what needed to be done and went on their way. That's real heroes for you. They don't do it for the glory. The incident became required discussion in the local police academy's training sessions. Study how these soldiers handled the situation, instructors would say. They stayed calm, tried to de-escalate, and when force became necessary, they used exactly what was needed. No more, no less. As summer turned to fall, the story remained a proud part of the town's identity. Locals would tell visitors, "See that gas station? That's where some bullies learned the hard way. You can't judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover is wearing Army Rangers training." 1 month after the infamous gas station incident, something unexpected happened that changed everything. Snake, sitting in his jail cell, wrote a letter that surprised everyone who read it. The former biker gang leader had done a lot of thinking during his time behind bars. Dear Staff Sergeant Morgan and team, the letter began, his usually messy handwriting carefully neat. I'm writing to apologize for what happened that night at Pete's gas station. Being in jail has given me time to think about my choices and who I really want to be. Sheriff Davidson personally delivered the letter to Fort Campbell after verifying it was genuine. He found Morgan and his team finishing up their morning training exercises. The 4 soldiers gathered around as the sheriff read Snake's words aloud. What you guys did that night, it wasn't just about fighting. Snake's letter continued. You showed me what real strength looks like. It's not about being the biggest bully or scaring people. It's about discipline, respect, and doing the right thing. The letter revealed that Snake was a veteran himself, though he'd never completed his service. He'd been discharged early and had spent years angry at the world, taking it out on everyone around him. The incident at the gas station had been a wake-up call. I talked to the other guys too. Snake wrote, We're all taking classes while we're in here. Anger management, GED prep, job training. Tiny's even talking about becoming a security guard when he gets out. Says he wants to protect people instead of scaring them. At Pete's Gas and Grocery, Earl had made some changes too. He turned one wall of his store into what he called the Community Hero Wall. It featured photos of local service members, police officers, and first responders. The security footage still from that night held a special place in the center. This wall reminds everyone who comes in, Earl explained to customers, that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just stop for gas and coffee. He'd also started offering free coffee to all military personnel and first responders. The incident had inspired others in unexpected ways. Local martial arts schools reported increased enrollment, but not from people wanting to learn how to fight. They want to learn about discipline and control, one instructor explained. They saw how those soldiers handled themselves. That's what they want to learn. Bill Thompson's viral video had led to something positive, too. His grandson helped him start a social media channel focused on sharing stories about veterans in their community. My grandpa went from filming one crazy night to becoming a real advocate for our service members, his grandson said proudly. The local high school invited Morgan and his team to speak at an assembly. At first, the soldiers were reluctant. They'd never wanted attention for what happened. But when they learned it was about conflict resolution and making good choices, they agreed. Fighting should always be the last resort, Morgan told the students. What we did that night wasn't about showing off or proving who was tougher. We tried to talk first. We gave warnings. Violence was their choice, not ours. Rodriguez added something that made the students think. Real strength isn't about making people fear you. It's about having the power to hurt someone but choosing not to unless you absolutely have to. The Steel Wolves' old hangout had transformed too. The bar where they used to gather was now a family restaurant. The owner had kept one of the gang's old signs as a reminder, but beneath it he'd added a new motto. Everyone welcome. Leave trouble at the door. In jail, Snake had pinned up the newspaper article about the incident in his cell. I look at it every morning, he wrote in his letter. It reminds me that it's never too late to change direction in life. You guys could have really hurt us that night, but you chose not to. That taught me more than any beating ever could. Sheriff Davidson noticed other positive changes in the community. Reports of violence had decreased significantly. Other troublemakers had either left town or changed their ways. Sometimes, he told his deputies, the right lesson at the right time can change everything. The story had become more than just a tale about a fight at a gas station. It had become a lesson about choices, consequences, and the possibility of change. Even the judge who sentenced Snake noted the difference. This case, Judge Martinez said during a follow-up hearing, has had an unprecedented ripple effect in our community. Sometimes it takes a dramatic event to show people a better way forward. 1 year after the famous gas station incident, Pete's Gas and Grocery hosted a special gathering that nobody could have predicted. The small parking lot was filled with people from all walks of life, including some very unexpected guests. Snake, now released from jail and wearing clean civilian clothes instead of his old leather vest, stood nervously near the entrance. Beside him were his former gang members, all of them looking very different from the troublemakers they'd been a year ago. Tiny had lost weight and wore a security guard uniform from his new job at the local mall. Razor walked with a slight limp from his old knee injury, but he smiled more now, especially when talking about his new job as a youth counselor. Staff Sergeant Morgan and his team had agreed to attend, though they still felt uncomfortable being called heroes. They arrived in their formal military uniforms, representing their unit at Fort Campbell. The crowd applauded as they stepped out of their vehicle, the same SUV from that fateful night. Never thought I'd be back here under these circumstances, Snake said, approaching Morgan with an extended hand. Thank you for teaching me the hardest and best lesson of my life. The handshake between former opponents became one of the most photographed moments of the day. Earl had organized this 1-year anniversary gathering to celebrate how one incident had changed their community. He'd set up a small stage where people could share their stories. The gas station sign now read, "Home of Second Chances, where change began." Bill Thompson, still proud of his viral video, sat in a place of honor. His social media channel about veteran stories had grown to have thousands of followers. Who would thought? He chuckled. One video turned me into an influencer at age 73. Sheriff Davidson spoke to the crowd about the changes he'd seen. In the past year, violent crime in our county has dropped by 60%, he announced. Sometimes the right example at the right time can change everything. Snake took his turn at the microphone, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. A year ago, I was a different person, he said, looking at the 4 soldiers. These men could have destroyed us that night, but instead, they showed us a better way. They taught us that real strength isn't about intimidation. It's about control, respect, and doing what's right. The local news cameras rolled as Tiny shared his story next. I used to think being big meant I had to be scary, he said, adjusting his security badge. Now I use my size to help people feel safe. Last week, I helped a lost kid find his mom at the mall. That felt better than any tough guy act I ever put on. Morgan and his team had been promoted over the past year, their handling of the gas station incident cited as an example of exceptional judgment under pressure. When Morgan finally spoke, his words were typically modest. "We didn't do anything special that night," he said. "We just applied our training and values. The real heroes are the people who choose to change their lives for the better." He looked directly at Snake and his former gang members as he said this. Earl unveiled a permanent memorial plaque on the gas station wall. It read, "On this spot, enemies became friends, and our community learned that it's never too late for a new beginning." Below the words was an engraved image of that famous night, showing both the confrontation and the reconciliation. The gathering turned into an impromptu community celebration. Local restaurants donated food, and people shared stories of how the incident had affected their lives. Former troublemakers talked about their journey to becoming productive citizens. Young people spoke about choosing better paths because of what they'd witnessed. As the sun began to set, much like it had on that fateful evening a year ago, Snake gathered his former gang members for a group photo with the soldiers. The image captured something remarkable. Former enemies standing together, all of them changed by one brief encounter at a gas station. "You know what's funny?" Snake said to Morgan as the cameras flashed. "That night, we thought we were teaching you a lesson. Instead, you taught us something that changed our lives forever." The story of Pete's Gas and Grocery became more than just a tale of soldiers versus bikers. It became a symbol of transformation, second chances, and the power of choosing a better path. The incident showed that sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest places, even at a quiet gas station on an ordinary evening. As people began to leave, Earl looked around his transformed gas station with pride. "Some people call it the miracle at Pete's," he said, "but I just call it proof that it's never too late to change your story."